Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The scorching African sun hovered lazily over the horizon as the rickety white bus screeched to a halt at the edge of Oreo. Dust swirled around its tires, dancing in the golden light, as 5 young women clambered out with their bags. The villagers had gathered to greet them, their faces a mix of curiosity and warmth. In this small village tucked away from modernity, the arrival of new National Youth Service Corps (NYSC) members was a significant event. Amara was the first to step down. Her confident stride and sharp gaze immediately set her apart. "Ladies, welcome to Oreo," she said, her tone carrying the authority of someone who often took charge. Behind her came Ifeanyi, who adjusted her glasses nervously while trying to avoid the dust. Next was Chiamaka, her bright smile and inquisitive eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Kemi followed, clutching a small Bible to her chest, and finally, Zainab, who trailed behind with a skeptical expression. The village headman, Chief Odian, stepped forward, his staff tapping rhythmically against the ground. His face was lined with age, his eyes holding a wisdom that commanded respect. Beside him stood the village elders, draped in traditional wrappers, and a group of excited children who peered curiously at the new arrivals. "Welcome to Oreo," Chief Odian said in a deep, resonant voice. "You are now part of our family. May your time here bring you fulfillment and wisdom." The Corpers nodded politely, each responding with the customary greeting, "Thank you, sir." The villagers cheered, breaking into song and dance. Drummers struck their skins with vigor, and women swayed rhythmically, their colorful wrappers fluttering. The young women couldn't help but smile, their initial apprehension melting away under the villagers' genuine hospitality. The 5 were led to their quarters, a modest bungalow on the outskirts of the village. The house was simple but comfortable, with 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a shared living area. It stood at the edge of the village, where the fields ended, and the ominous expanse of the forbidden forest began. "This isn't bad," Chiamaka said, dropping her bag onto a cot. "I was expecting worse." Amara chuckled. "See? I told you all this would be fine." Kemi walked to the window and froze. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the dense line of trees that loomed in the distance. "That," came a voice from the doorway, "is the forbidden forest." They turned to see Mama Ayabo, a stout, middle-aged woman who had been assigned as their caretaker. She carried a tray of fruits and a pot of steaming jollof rice. Her face, usually kind, now wore a serious expression. "You must never go there," she continued, setting the food down. "It is not a place for the living." The women exchanged skeptical glances, but Mama Ayabo ignored their doubt. "Many have entered that forest and never returned. It is said that the spirits of the wronged linger there, and they do not take kindly to intruders." "Spirits?" Zainab scoffed. "With all due respect, Ma, isn't that just an old superstition?" Mama Ayabo's eyes narrowed. "Call it what you will, but the forest has its rules. You would do well to respect them." That evening, the Corpers were the guests of honor at a grand welcome feast in the village square. The smell of roasted goat and freshly cooked yams filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and drums. Children darted between the adults, their excitement infectious. As the festivities continued, an elder rose to address the crowd. His voice carried over the drumming, silencing the chatter. "Our village is peaceful because we respect the balance between the living and the spirits," he said. "The forbidden forest is not a place for mortals. Even we, who have lived beside it for generations, do not enter." Chiamaka leaned toward Amar. "This is starting to sound like a bad campfire story." Amara smirked. "Or a challenge." Ifeanyi overheard and frowned. "You can't be serious, Amara. These people clearly believe in this." "Belief doesn't make it real," Amara whispered back. "Besides, don't you want to see for yourself?" Before Ifeanyi could respond, the elder concluded his speech, and the villagers erupted into applause. The night continued with more dancing and laughter, but a subtle unease lingered in the air. Back at their quarters, the women settled in for the night. Kemi lit a candle and muttered a prayer before lying down. Ifeanyi checked the locks on the door twice, her nerves still unsettled. Zainab, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes at the others' caution and climbed into bed. As the others dozed off, Amara sat by the window, staring out at the dark silhouette of the forbidden forest. The moonlight cast long shadows over the trees, and the air seemed to hum with a faint, eerie energy. Her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. "This village has secrets," she murmured to herself. "And we're going to uncover them." From the depths of the forest, a faint sound carried on the wind, low, mournful, and almost human. Amara's gaze lingered on the trees before she finally turned away and crawled into bed. The night passed uneventfully, but the forest watched and waited. The sun rose over Oreo with a golden brilliance, casting a warm glow over the village. The bustling of women heading to the market, the crowing of roosters, and the laughter of children filled the air. The Corpers were adjusting to their new environment, splitting their time between lesson planning for the local school and exploring the village. However, Amara's focus remained on the forbidden forest. "We're doing this today," she announced one morning, clapping her hands as if to seal the decision. The others looked up from their breakfast of akra and pap, confusion etched on their faces. "Doing what?" Ifeanyi asked, already dreading the answer. "We're going into the forbidden forest," Amara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We've been here a week, and all anyone talks about is how dangerous it is. Don't you want to know what's actually in there?" Chiamaka's eyes lit up. "You mean, like an adventure?" "I'm in." Kemi frowned, her fingers gripping her Bible. "This isn't a joke, Amar. The villagers have been very clear. That place is dangerous." "It's all superstition," Amara countered, waving a dismissive hand. "They probably just want to keep us out because it's sacred or something." Zainab, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "I agree with Amara. We're educated women, we should see for ourselves. Who knows? It might even be a great story to tell when we're done." Ifeanyi shook her head. "This is reckless. What if something happens? What if we get lost?" "We won't," Amara said confidently. "I've got a map, flashlights, and enough snacks to last us a day. We'll be in and out before anyone notices." Despite their reservations, the group eventually gave in to Amara's persistence. By mid-morning, they were standing at the edge of the forest, the dense trees towering over them like ancient sentinels. The air was cooler here, and an unsettling stillness hung in the atmosphere. "This is a bad idea," Ifeanyi muttered, clutching her backpack tightly. "It's just a forest," Amara said, stepping forward. "Come on." The forest swallowed them whole. Within minutes, the village disappeared behind them, and the world became a tangle of thick trees, vines, and shadows. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting the ground in a dim, greenish hue. The air was heavy, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures. "This place feels alive," Kemi whispered, her voice barely audible. Chiamaka laughed nervously. "Of course it's alive. It's a forest." "No, I mean like it's watching us." Amara rolled her eyes. "Stop spooking yourself. Focus on the path." But the path was the first thing to betray them. What had seemed like a clear trail suddenly splintered into multiple directions. Each path looked identical, and the deeper they ventured, the more it felt like the forest was shifting around them. "Wait," Zainab said, halting. "This wasn't here before." She pointed to a cluster of trees whose gnarled roots had grown together, forming a grotesque shape that vaguely resembled a face. The others stared in silence, unease creeping into their hearts. "It's just trees," Amara said firmly, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Keep moving." As they pressed on, the forest began to change. The air grew colder, and the ground became uneven. Strange sounds echoed around them, low whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "What was that?" Ifeanyi asked, spinning around. "Probably the wind," Amara said, though her pace quickened. Then they saw it, a figure in the distance. It stood motionless, shrouded in shadow, holding a faintly glowing lantern. The light flickered like a dying flame, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding trees. As they approached cautiously, the figure stepped into the light, revealing its headless form. Ifeananya screamed, and Kemi clutched her Bible, reciting a prayer under her breath. The headless man turned slowly, his lantern swaying, and began to walk away. "Do we follow it?" Chiamaka asked, her voice trembling. Amara hesitated but nodded. "It's the only thing we've seen that might lead us somewhere." Reluctantly, they followed the figure deeper into the forest. The whispers grew louder, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The headless man led them to a clearing where a moss-covered well stood. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground was littered with strange carvings etched into the dirt. "What is this place?" Zainab asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just a well," Amara said, though even she sounded uncertain. Chiamaka stepped closer, peering into the darkness. "I think there's something down there." "Chiamaka, don't," Ifeananya warned, but it was too late. The ground beneath Chiamaka's feet crumbled, and she tumbled into the well with a scream. The others rushed forward, peering into the abyss, but all they could see was darkness. "Chiamaka!" Amara shouted, her voice echoing. I'm here." Chiamaka's voice was faint and distant, as though coming from a great depth. "But I can't see anything." "Hold on," Amara said, tearing at the vines nearby to make a makeshift rope. "We'll get you out." As they worked, the forest seemed to come alive. The trees groaned, their branches twisting unnaturally, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices. Shapes moved in the shadows, figures with glowing eyes and elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. "Hurry!" Kemi cried, clutching her Bible as she prayed fervently. Amara tossed the rope into the well, but as Chiamaka grabbed hold, the vines began to fray, as though something was cutting them from below. "I can't hold on," Chiamaka screamed. The rope snapped, and her voice disappeared into the darkness. The well went silent. "No!" Amara yelled, dropping to her knees. Tears streamed down her face, but there was nothing she could do. The headless man reappeared, standing at the edge of the clearing, his lantern now glowing brighter. He raised his hand as though beckoning them to follow. "We have to go," Zainab said, her voice shaking. "No." Amara hesitated, staring at the well, before finally nodding. "We'll come back for her. We have to survive first." The group followed the headless man once more, their fear mounting with each step. The forest continued to shift and twist, its supernatural horrors growing more vivid. The women were no longer just explorers, they were prey in a game they couldn't understand. The forest had claimed its first victim, and it wasn't done yet. The forest pressed in around them, suffocating and alive. The towering trees seemed to lean closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The eerie glow of the headless man's lantern was the only thing guiding Amara, Kemi, Ifeananya, and Zainab through the oppressive darkness. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself were trying to pull them into the earth. "We can't just leave her," Ifeananya whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to go back for Chiamaka." "We will," Amara said, her jaw tight. "But not now. We don't even know how to get out of here." "She's all alone," Ifeananya continued, her words choked with guilt. "What if—" "Stop it!" Amara snapped, spinning around to face her. "Do you think I don't feel the same way? I made the decision to come here, and I'll get us out. But right now, we need to stay alive." Ifeananya fell silent, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her flashlight. The headless man continued his silent march, his lantern swaying with an unnatural rhythm. The whispers in the air grew louder, taking on distinct voices, some crying, others laughing, and a few speaking in languages they couldn't understand. Kemi clung to her Bible, muttering prayers under her breath. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Zainab, her usual bravado stripped away, stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the shadows that moved just beyond the reach of their light. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "It can't be real." They reached another clearing, but this one was different. In the center stood a massive tree, its roots twisting and coiling like serpents. Hanging from its branches were objects that looked like dolls, Crudely carved figures made of sticks and straw, their faces painted with what appeared to be blood. The sight froze them in their tracks. What is this place? Kemi asked, her voice barely audible. The center of the forest's power, Zainab muttered, though her tone was uncertain. It has to be. Amara stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the grotesque scene. The dolls swayed gently, though there was no wind. The ground beneath the tree was littered with bones, human and animal, all bleached white by time. Don't touch anything, Kemi warned. This is evil. Amara ignored her, drawn to a large carving etched into the trunk of the tree. It depicted a group of figures kneeling before a woman with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. Around her were symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when looked at for too long. This must be the forest's origin, Amara said, her voice a mix of fascination and fear. The villagers talked about vengeful spirits. Maybe this is... Before she could finish, the ground beneath her feet shifted. A low rumble echoed through the clearing, and the tree's roots began to move. Run! Zainab screamed, grabbing Kemi's arm and pulling her away. The roots lashed out like whips, tearing through the earth and snapping at the women. Amara dove to the side as one root slammed into the spot where she'd been standing. The headless man turned and began walking again, his lantern glowing brighter as if urging them to follow. This way! Amara shouted, scrambling to her feet and running after the figure. The others followed, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest came alive around them, the trees groaning and shifting, their branches forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for the fleeing women. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the air became heavy with the stench of decay. As they ran, Zainab suddenly stopped, her eyes wide with terror. Did you hear that? Hear what? Amara asked, though her heart was pounding too loudly to catch anything else. It's Chiamaka, Zainab said, her voice trembling. She's calling for help. The others froze, straining their ears. Sure enough, a faint voice echoed through the trees. Help me, please. That's her. Ifyananya cried. We have to go back. No, Kemi said firmly, gripping Ifyananya's arm. That's not Chiamaka. But it's a trick. Kemi shouted, her usually calm demeanor breaking. The spirits are trying to lure us. Don't you see? Ifyananya hesitated, torn between her fear and her desire to save her friend. Before she could decide, the headless man turned and began walking again, his lantern growing dimmer. We have to keep moving, Amara said, pulling Ifyananya forward. If we stop now, we'll never make it out. The group pressed on, but their ordeal was far from over. They came across another strange sight. A pool of water so still it looked like glass. The surface reflected the trees and sky above, but when the women peered into it, they didn't see their own reflections. Instead, they saw distorted versions of themselves, faces twisted in pain, eyes hollow and lifeless. This is madness, Zainab whispered, stepping back. We're going to die here. Stop saying that. Amara snapped, though her own fear was evident. We're not going to die. We just have to. Before she could finish, the pool rippled, and a hand shot out, grasping at her leg. Amara screamed, falling to the ground as the hand, pale and skeletal, began pulling her toward the water. Help me, she yelled, clawing at the dirt. Kemi and Zainab rushed forward, grabbing her arms and pulling with all their strength. The skeletal hand was unnaturally strong, its bony fingers digging into Amara's leg. Let her go! Kemi screamed, slamming her Bible against the hand. The pages seemed to glow faintly, and the hand recoiled, disappearing back into the water. Amara scrambled to her feet, her leg bleeding but otherwise intact. Thanks, she said breathlessly. We need to get out of here, Ifyananya said, her voice breaking. No. The headless man led them to yet another clearing, this one dominated by a massive stone altar. Carvings covered its surface, depicting scenes of violence and despair. The women hesitated, their fear reaching its peak. We shouldn't be here, Kemi whispered. Then why did he bring us here? Zainab asked, her voice sharp. Before anyone could answer, the ground trembled, and ghostly figures began to materialize around them. They were translucent, their faces twisted in rage and sorrow. One by one, They turned to the women, their hollow eyes filled with accusation. "You do not belong," one of the spirits hissed, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "We're sorry," Kemi said, dropping to her knees. "We didn't mean to disturb you." "Sorry is not enough," the spirit said. "You have trespassed on sacred ground. You must pay the price." The spirits began to close in, their forms growing more solid with each step. Amara, Kemi, Ifyananya, and Zainab clung to each other, their terror overwhelming them. And then, just as the spirits reached them, the headless man stepped forward, raising his lantern. Its light flared brightly, and the spirits recoiled, their forms dissolving into mist. For a moment, the clearing was silent. Then the headless man turned, his lantern flickering, and began walking again. "This isn't over," Amara said, her voice shaking. "Not by a long shot." And with that, they followed the headless man deeper into the forest, knowing that their nightmare was far from over. The journey deeper into the forest became a harrowing ordeal. Each step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was trying to trap them. The oppressive atmosphere weighed on the group, the once vibrant courage Amara exuded now dulled by the horrors they had witnessed. Behind them, the faint echoes of whispers and cries followed, haunting and relentless. The headless man's lantern dimmed further with each passing moment, the flickering light barely enough to pierce the darkness. The women trudged on in silence, their fear now a tangible presence that clung to them like a second skin. The village's unease. Back in Oreo, the forest's wrath was beginning to spill over. The villagers noticed strange occurrences. Livestock disappeared without a trace, crops wilted overnight, and an unnatural fog began to creep from the forest's edge toward the village. Chief Odian sat in his compound, the weight of his people's fear pressing heavily on his chest. The chief priest, an elderly man with a staff adorned with cowrie shells and feathers, entered the compound unannounced. His expression was grave. "Chief, the spirits are restless," the priest said, his voice low and steady. "The Corpers have trespassed, and now the balance is broken." Chief Odian sighed deeply. "What must we do, Ozioma?" The priest shook his head. "There is only one way to appease the spirits. We must offer sacrifices and perform the ancient rituals. If we fail, the forest's wrath will consume us all." The villagers gathered at the shrine that night, their voices raised in prayer and song. They lit fires and made offerings of food, drink, and livestock. The chief priest led the rituals, his chants resonating through the night as the villagers begged the spirits for mercy. A clearing of judgment. Meanwhile, the Corpers were led to a massive clearing, one that felt different from the rest of the forest. The ground was covered in ash, and the air was thick with the stench of burnt flesh. In the center stood a ring of stones, each etched with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The headless man stopped, his lantern flickering once before extinguishing completely. The women huddled together, their eyes darting around the clearing as the whispers grew louder. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. These were not the fleeting shapes they had seen before but fully formed apparitions. They were translucent yet terrifyingly real, men and women with faces twisted in pain and anger. Their bodies bore the marks of violence, stab wounds, broken limbs, and burns. One spirit stepped forward, its form larger and more defined than the others. It was a woman with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like embers. Her voice echoed as she spoke, carrying the weight of centuries of anger. "You have entered sacred ground," she said. "You have disturbed our rest." "We're sorry," Kemi said, stepping forward despite her trembling hands. She held her Bible close. "We didn't mean to offend you." The spirit's eyes bore into her, unyielding. "Your apologies cannot undo what has been done. The forest remembers, and it does not forgive." Amara, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "We didn't know. If we'd known, we wouldn't have come. Please, just let us go, and we'll never come back." The spirit tilted her head, her movements unnaturally fluid. "It is not your ignorance that binds you here. It is your arrogance. The forest has judged you, and its judgment is final." The spirits began to circle them, chanting in a language none of the women understood. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath them began to shake. The Corpers screamed, clinging to one another as the spirits closed in. The village's rescue mission. In the village, the chief priest finished his chants and threw a handful of powdered herbs into the fire. The flames roared to life, turning a vivid blue before dying down. The priest's eyes fluttered open, and he looked at Chief Odion. "The spirits have granted us a chance," he said. "But it will not be without sacrifice." The villagers prepared for the rescue mission, gathering charms, herbs, and offerings. The chief priest led a group of elders and young men into the forest, their path lit by torches and guided by the priest's staff, which glowed faintly in the darkness. The forest resisted their presence. Branches reached out to block their path, and the whispers grew louder, taunting and threatening them. One of the young men screamed as a shadowy figure lunged at him, but the priest raised his staff, and the figure dissolved into mist. "Stay close," the priest commanded. "The forest will test us, but we must not falter." The spirit's verdict. Back in the clearing, the spirit's chant reached a crescendo. The women felt their bodies grow heavy as if an unseen force was pulling them to the ground. The glowing-eyed spirit stepped forward, raising her elongated arms. "You shall remain here," she declared, her voice echoing with finality. "Your spirits will nourish the forest, and your bodies will wither like the leaves." "No!" Amara screamed, struggling against the invisible force. "Please, don't do this." The spirits began to converge, their forms merging into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The Corpers could feel their energy draining, their vision dimming. Just as the vortex closed in, a burst of light illuminated the clearing. The chief priest and his group had arrived, their chants cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. The spirits recoiled, their forms flickering as the priest raised his staff. "Spirits of the forest," the priest called out. "We offer these sacrifices to appease your wrath. Take them and release these young women." The villagers placed their offerings on the ground, bowls of blood, kola nuts, and a goat, its neck already slit. The glowing-eyed spirit regarded the priest with disdain. "You dare to bargain with us?" she hissed. "These intruders have defiled our sacred ground. Their lives belong to the forest." The priest bowed his head. "I beg your mercy. Spare them, and we will honor your memory for generations." The spirit seemed to consider this, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Very well," she said finally. "But they will not leave unscathed." Curse. The spirits vanished, and the invisible force holding the women disappeared. They collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the villagers rushed to their side. The priest knelt beside them, murmuring prayers of protection. "You are safe now," he said, though his voice was heavy with sadness. As the group made their way back to the village, the women realized the truth of the spirit's words. Each of them bore a mark of the forest's wrath. Amara's once bright eyes were now dull and haunted. Ifyananya's voice trembled whenever she spoke. Kemi's hands shook uncontrollably, and Zainab, the skeptic, refused to speak at all. When they returned to Oreo, the villagers greeted them with relief, but the Corpers knew their ordeal was far from over. They were cursed to remain in the village forever, bound by the forest's power. Though they had survived, they were no longer the same. The forest had taken something from each of them, leaving scars that would never fade. The village resumed its prayers and rituals, hoping to restore balance. But in the depths of the forbidden forest, the spirits watched and waited, their vengeance far from sated. The dawn in Oreo broke like any other, soft hues of pink and orange washing over the village. Yet the air was heavy with unease, as though the forest's shadows still lingered, even in the light of day. The Corpers had been rescued, but the villagers knew the ordeal was far from over. The forest had allowed them to return, but at a price. The aftermath. Amara, Ifyananya, Kemi, and Zainab sat in silence inside their bungalow, their faces pale and drawn. The once vibrant group now bore the weight of their harrowing experience. Amara, the leader who had once exuded confidence, stared out the window, her eyes dull and unfocused. Ifyananya sat in the corner, hugging her knees to her chest, while Kemi clutched her Bible, muttering prayers under her breath. Zainab hadn't spoken a word since they returned. "It's over," Amara said finally, her voice a shadow of its former strength. "We're alive. But at what cost?" Kemi asked, her voice trembling. We'll never leave this place. The spirits have bound us here. Better than being dead, Zainab muttered, breaking her silence. Her tone was bitter, her eyes hard. But we might as well be. The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared guilt and fear pressing down on them. Chiamaka's absence was a gaping hole in their group, and none of them could shake the image of her slipping into the darkness of the well. The chief priest's warning. The chief priest visited them that afternoon, his staff tapping rhythmically against the ground as he entered their bungalow. His presence commanded respect, and the women sat up as he addressed them. The forest has spared your lives, but its wrath is not easily soothed, he began. You carry its mark now, and your lives are no longer your own. What does that mean? Amara asked, her voice edged with desperation. The priest looked at her with pity. You are bound to this village. You can never leave. The forest will always call you back. If you try to go, you will suffer, physically, spiritually, and mentally. Ifyananya gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. We're prisoners? No, the priest said, though his tone was heavy. You are guardians now. The forest has claimed you as its own. Your role is to ensure its balance is maintained. It is the only way to appease the spirits. The curse revealed. In the days that followed, the women began to notice changes in themselves, subtle at first, but undeniable. Amara's dreams were filled with vivid, terrifying images of the forest. She often woke in the middle of the night, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing. Ifyananya discovered she could hear whispers, even outside the forest. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but the voices became clearer, guiding her to injured villagers or hidden dangers. It was a gift, but it felt like a curse. Kemi began to experience visions, glimpses of the future that came unbidden and often left her shaken. She saw snippets of joy, but also tragedies yet to come, and the burden of knowing was almost too much to bear. Zainab's transformation was the most physical. Her once warm brown eyes now glowed faintly in the dark, and her skin seemed to shimmer under moonlight. She avoided mirrors and the curious gazes of the villagers, retreating further into herself. Acceptance and purpose. Weeks turned into months, and the Corpers slowly adjusted to their new reality. They threw themselves into their work, teaching the village children and aiding the community in any way they could. The villagers, initially wary of them, began to see them as protectors, intermediaries between the living and the spirits of the forest. Amara took on the role of leader once more, though her confidence was tempered by humility. Ifyananya became a healer, using the whispers to guide her to medicinal herbs and helping those in need. Kemi became a spiritual guide, her visions earning her the respect of even the most devout villagers. Zainab, despite her reluctance, became a guardian of the forest, ensuring its boundaries were respected. A visit to the forest. One evening, the chief priest summoned them. The forest had called for them, and they could not refuse. Dressed in simple white garments, the women followed the priest into the woods. The air was heavy, the trees silent as they walked. The forest seemed to recognize them, its shadows parting to reveal a path that led to the same clearing where their lives had changed forever. The glowing-eyed spirit appeared once more, her presence as commanding as before. This time, however, her expression was less vengeful, more solemn. You have learned humility, she said. You have embraced your roles. The forest sees this and grants you its favor. The women bowed their heads, unsure of what favor she spoke of. The spirit raised her elongated arms, and a soft light enveloped them. You will carry our power, the spirit continued. Use it wisely, for the balance of life and death is fragile. Should you falter, the forest's wrath will return, and it will not show mercy. The light faded, and the spirit disappeared. The forest returned to its unnatural stillness. The eternal guardians. Back in the village, the Corpers were no longer just strangers or outsiders. They were now part of Oreo, their lives entwined with its history and its curse. The villagers revered them, but the women knew their fate was not one to be envied. They sat together one night, gazing at the forest from their bungalow. The stars shone brightly above, and the village was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. We're different now, Ifyananya said, breaking the silence. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Amara nodded. We've been given a second chance. We owe it to Chiamaka to make it count. The others murmured their agreement, their resolve strengthening. They were no longer mere Corpers, sent to serve a community for a year. They were something more, keepers of a fragile peace between the living and the dead, forever bound to the village of Oreo and the Forbidden Forest. And so, their story became a part of the village's lore, whispered around fires and passed down through generations. The Forbidden Forest remained as mysterious and foreboding as ever, but now, it had guardians who understood its power and respected its wrath. The forest watched and waited, its ancient spirits ever vigilant, knowing that one day, its balance might be threatened again. But for now, there was peace. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.